what wonderful work. And to spend half an hour moving through the city with narratives that you've drawn from so many people is incredibly affective. It takes you on some tricky lines, doesn't it? It pursues some tricky lines, but it takes you down some of those closes, excuse the pun, but it does open some terrific questions. So now I'm going to, without further pun, open up the grid view, Lauren, if we can take us off Spotlight, and begin to open up some questions. I'll get things going, just because that's perhaps the privilege of the chair, and begin to ask the team about how they felt producing it. I always enjoyed Steve Pyle's geography work around the idea of the spectral city, and to some extent the challenges in scraping around or moving around things that we find in the present to reveal the past. And in doing so, you release so many ghosts, and you're in danger of letting those ghosts haunt and you can't control what they release. And I think there's a moment in a couple of moments in the movie where you open up some terrific moments which send shivers down spines, actually, because it questions what I know as such a civil, beautiful tourist World Heritage Site, and it changes. I wonder how you felt. Did you anticipate opening so many doors into the past and releasing so many ghosts?
I want to kind of see that first, because Edinburgh's kind of my ghost, my kind of fantasy. But in the process of making the film, we found out that some of the kind of ghosts are a lot less pretty than they look, and we're massively in Jeff Palmer, who I think is on the phone, debt for that. I mean, in the Dundas statue in St Andrew's Square commemorates a history that, even though it's right smack bang in your face, you don't see. And it is that process of film as a methodology that kind of allows you to walk around, talk to people, look at things, and see something different. And sometimes they are, quite terrifying ghosts.
It is, and of course, Edinburgh manages its identity so very carefully. And when Jeff, if you're on the line, you offer that cut. It's
okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
It was quite early in the movie when it suddenly makes that move, and I believe Sapphire and Liz caught it more recently in the editing process. But do you want to speak, because it's incredibly powerful moment when you understand this implication of the street names, which we become so used to in Edinburgh, and they're now haunted thoroughly.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the film all the way through, and I'd like to thank and congratulate you all for doing it. Now, if we come to the Henry Dundas statue, and as I said, he was a tremendously powerful politician, but I also heard you mention the Royal Bank of Scotland, and if you look to the right of Henry Dundas, looking north, there is this enormous, grand, magnificent house. And it is the house of Henry Dundas's relative. And that's Dundas's house, Dundas House. Yeah. And now that's the headquarters of the Royal Bank of Scotland. So you have this statue to Henry Dundas, who delayed the abolition of the slave trade, 150 feet high. But to one side of him is this enormous house, which was built in about 1774 for his relative, Lawrence Dundas. And to build it there, they moved the St. Andrew's Church was moved onto George Street in order that he could put his townhouse there.
Extraordinary movement of this production of space, if you like, the way that the city then denies some histories and quite rudely moves other stories into the future or into the present at the time is quite astonishing. I think I've been in Edinburgh for 10 years now, and the movie, certainly the film, allows us to move through some of these cuts as we travel. Darren, how did you...
Could I just add a little bit to that? That as I said, it was built for Lawrence Dundas, who was a slave trader. However, in 2019, the Royal Bank asked me to speak to young financiers, and these were black and ethnic minority groups. And when I started off my speech to say, you're standing in a building that is part of your heritage, there was stunned silence.
Wow.
And at the end of the evening, a black financier came up to me and he said, you saying that has changed my future because I no longer feel like a stranger in the city.
Isn't that so powerful? Wow. Well, I mean, I think the contribution, I mean, amongst many people, has really opens up so many challenging perspectives on a city that is often portrayed with such grace, but actually it's a challenging city. If you don't mind, can I ask other participants perhaps turn their cameras on now, because you've all been very polite and waiting in the wings, literally. And Jeff will never see your face at the moment because you're ringing your mobile. But,
it might be more pleasure for you.
But thank you, Melissa. Thank you. Here they come. Liz, how do I do this? How do I move around? Darren, David, Sapphire, how do I help navigate around some of these characters? Because as they turn the cameras on, you begin to recover, I think, some of the powerful voices that offered that palimpsest, if you like, across the city. I mean, we could begin to move some of the questions. Let me try and do that. Patricia asks, and I'll let a few of you run on this because you've been in and out of the building. What would Florence Nightingale, who championed data-informed policy, make of how we're using data in the current pandemic? Because, of course, there's these wonderful micro, as well as the macro views of the city, and Sapphire takes us extremely close to some organisms which are beyond sight, as it were. Anyone think about that? I wonder, David, you evoked the digital before we started.
I can't say much about Florence Nightingale, not my specialist subject, but you know, from what I understand about her use of data and visualizations, you know, one contrast between what's happening now is that she was responding to problems in a local setting, you know, so she was there on the ground, and then the solution kind of emerged from that. But I think Lucas might be better placed to answer this. I don't know if...
Terrific. Lucas.
Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Excellent. It's a beautiful question, but it's a very unsatisfying answer that I can offer. And I think it's always very difficult to make speculative answers about, or to make speculative assertions about what would figures from the past think about the present. The one thing I would emphasize is the question of speed and time. Florence Nightingale argued and engaged with not only issues and questions that were very heavily localized, but also which developed in a very different time frame, in a very different time scale. And I think she would share, certainly as a contemporary of us, but also particularly as a Victorian figure, a puzzlement and a feeling of overwhelmingness with regards to the numbers games and the visualizations regarding COVID-19 today. That would be, I think, my guess.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? As the stories and the data become interwoven. I mean, we get so many data visualizations that we're used to now, but I find finding myself in those data visualizations is very tricky indeed. Joe asks, Joe Brannigan offers us both a history and asks a very pointed question. Perhaps Melissa, Leslie might be able to help answer this. I know there's some interesting, but loved it, placing EFI in such an amazing context. Knew it as a working hospital. My son was born there, friends married in the chapel, and then looked after it for a while the plans of EFI took shape. Thank you, and I hope the donation boards in the infirmary would feature, but they maybe deserve a film in their own right. And I wonder if Melissa and Leslie, those terrific boards, you might have to explain what they are a little bit, because I've seen them in sight, but I guess they've been extracted now from the building.
So the donation boards, so my name is Melissa, I'm the Director of Research for the Futures Institute. So the donation boards were in the hall as you came in the main doors, and it was lists of all the people who had given money to the old Royal Infirmary going right back to when it opened. And they were big, huge names and lovely writing with the amount that people had given to. And some of it was lots of money and some of it was not very much money, but it was a record on the history of Edinburgh and the benefactors of Edinburgh at a time before the National Health Service, at a time when hospitals did depend on the generosity of the city and the generosity of people who lived in the city. Now, when we came to restore the building, there were some decisions to be made about that, because some of the boards were in places that we were going to have to extend into. So what we did is we documented them fully, so they've all been digitized at a really high resolution. So we do have a record of all of the boards, and I think some of them are still in place. But the important thing is to know that there was a documentation throughout the whole process so that we didn't lose any of the historical features of the building. It was in fairly poor nick when we took it over. The first time I went round it was a few years ago, and there was 72 different points of water ingress in this building. And it was one of those days that had rained the night before, and the water was just pouring through this building. So for the university to take it on, and it's now windtight and watertight, and we're starting the fitting out. 2 years later, we're starting the fitting out of the inside. It's amazing to see this building be transformed. It does mean that not all of the original features are still there. Some of them were rotten through, some of the walls were rotten through. We'd hope to keep, for example, a lot of the wooden floors, but some of them were just too far gone with rot. So we've kept what we can, but we've documented the complete building before we started, and we're documenting the build as we go as well. So we have a photographer who's going in every couple of months and recording how this building is being transformed, so that we can go back and we can look at what it took to transform such a beautiful and magnificent and complex building. And it is one of those projects that has to iterate as we go forward because of the complexity. I don't know if Leslie wants to come in there and say anything else.
Thanks, Melissa. Yes, I would like to contribute, because somebody mentioned people have stories about the building, about people who were born there, people died there, a lot of suffering in that building, a lot of hope. I myself has been a patient in that building. It saved my life in Ward 9, the critical care ward. I was saved in that ward, so I have a great connection to that building. But everybody you talk to who's lived in Edinburgh has a connection to it, and we want to be able to capture that. And we're trying to speak to everybody who is still alive, who's actually worked and been in that building. And so that's an ongoing project. And we want to have an archive of those stories. The ghosts of that building, they've passed through in the making of the building. They found lots of bones. I believe they found bones of horses in the building. Not quite sure where they came from, whether they were teaching bones or not. And there are stories of the builders feeling hands on their shoulders when they're working there on their own, and then turning around and not seeing anybody there. So there is a sense of presence of that past in as we remake the future, which is on one level alarming, but also rather exciting. And one of the things that we're going to do when we move forward near to the point of opening is we're going to have some kind of pageant or ceremony or some kind of way of repurposing that building, so that we acknowledge the past and we look forward to a different future for that building.
I'm going to stay with you for a moment, Leslie, because there is this, you're quite keen on the use of the word contagion, and Siobhan Dunn asks about, is there a new meaning now for the
I think this is so ironic that having talked about contagion and saying that this is about, interdisciplinarity is a metaphor for interdisciplinarity, and yet we find ourselves in this pandemic, and the notion of contagion now, it seems such a contaminated word in its own right. So I think, do we want to keep, we've appropriated the word contagion to describe something we're trying to do, and I think it gives it more resonance and an interesting feel. I think for me, the thing that is wonderful about the building in terms of contagion is it has monumental spaces, monumental corridors, places where people will meet and talk and deliberate. Everybody knows, I think, that the greatest leaps in knowledge come from those serendipitous moments when you meet someone or an idea comes in and then something sparks and something transforms. And if we can create that kind of a space, that's the kind of contagion that we want. I think the pandemic at the moment, for me, the things that it says about society, how communities come together, everything about what the role of a university is and what its purpose is in terms of helping society recover, using its knowledge in positive ways, opening up and rebuilding communities. For me, that makes the Edinburgh Futures Institute actually even more important just now, important for the city, and I hope that we will be able to put ourselves in the service of our community. I think that's what it's about.
Yeah, terrific. I mean, Liz has this question, and this is perhaps back to the. I mean, Leslie could naturally answer this, but I wonder how Liz and Sapphire and Darren, David might come in around the question of hygiene, cleanliness, and moral hygiene. And Liz's question is about how compassion is going to be at the centre of EFI, which I think to some extent Les has answered. But I wonder how you see that mood of the city. Whether we can have is Edinburgh a compassionate city? Liz, Darren, do you find it a compassionate city at all? I mean, of course, Jeff represents one where it's underlined by a bottom line of finance. Did you find it a compassionate city?
I think there's a lot of compassion in the city as I found it. I mean, this is a personal view now. It just happens to be something that is sort of a corollary of making the film in Edinburgh. And I think there's a lot of compassion in different levels, but it's also contested, it seems. So there's individual compassion. I mean, I think partly the film is an individual story, like Liz says. It's one of her ghosts, and it's very much a story. I think I see it as a story, in part, of Liz's return to Edinburgh, and prior to that, we made a film about Milton Keynes, and I've just 7 years ago came back to Milton Keynes to do my PhD. And so there's this kind of individual sort of compassion that you develop with your memories of a place and with your interactions with the place, and I think that's one level that we can talk about a lot, and it's very personal to each of us. Then there's a sort of institutional level of compassion, perhaps, which is perhaps more what Leslie's talking about. There's a great sense of belonging to people in the university and in the city, I think, but then at the same time, as comes out in the film and people say, there's a great sense of unbelonging as well, where the hierarchies are there to be seen. And I think it seems, as I'm sure everybody notices, that with the COVID stuff, the kind of fractures within our society becoming more exposed and more apparent and perhaps more clear for us to help to be able to address them somehow, given the tools and the sensibilities. So yeah, Edinburgh is a compassionate city, but I think Milton Keynes is too. And I think there's an opposite there in that, like you were saying, Chris, Milton Keynes, you're saying Edinburgh was this great place, this tourist place, and then underneath there's this underbelly of something else going on. I think Milton Keynes is the opposite of that, where people think this is a terrible place that nobody would ever want to go to, but underneath it there's a great wealth of cultural activity that we uncovered in our other film.
Terrific. I'm going to, Sapphire, I'm going to ask you to address Thomas Shadler's question, which is, in what sense is Edinburgh different in its reflections around the past and contemplation of the futures from other European cities? And I ask you because you obviously were behind the camera and you were taking and you layered so many layers, and you've got a visual vocabulary for, I'm sure, European cities. And I wonder, how is it different? And does the image get past that, or?
Well, there's probably a few European cities who wear its history very heavily in that same sort of sense. You know, I think I said in my introductory speech, it's sort of dipped in aspic in some ways. This theme park facade, this sort of Harry Potter world, like very touristy. But I think looking under that makes it somehow more interesting. I like exploring cities that are unusual, places like Las Vegas and Milton Keynes and Acapulco, places I've written about, and Edinburgh's the same. It's got a very postcard image in one sense, but there's a lot of different things in different areas, and like we could only really focus on the centre, but it'd be interesting perhaps to explore places like Leith and their history and Granton. But I think, yeah, there are some European cities that are like that, possibly like Paris, that are very like historical, and then there are probably ones that are a bit more modern and a bit more evolving. And that's not to say that I think that things should be knocked down or either way, but it's just things are done mindfully, I guess.
Terrific. Nicholas, you wanted to come in and offer a thought.
Yes, so first of all, thanks for having me. I'm the PhD student. So referring to Mr. Scheller's question, I think there's some sort of global narratives which affect many European cities when you think about globalization, when you think about climate change. And in the UK context, I think there's on top of that this idea of austerity, and that cities are increasingly sort of having to deal with a lack of resources and with increasing inter-urban competition. But I think when it comes to Edinburgh, I think what sort of comes out of my research is that Edinburgh is perceived as a city of ideas. And I think this becomes quite apparent when thinking about the Enlightenment and when thinking about data-driven innovation nowadays. I think it really is able to position itself as a city of ideas, for example, compared to Glasgow, which has, I guess, a different history when you think about the industrial it does industrial history. So I think when it comes to Edinburgh as a city, I think it's sort of differentiating itself as a city of ideas. And when it comes to data-driven innovation, I think it can really lead the way, for example, by focusing on the aspect of data ethics, which I think is one of the big aspects and ideas coming out of this data-driven innovation program.
And B, I know you work perhaps as a computer scientist. I know you work in natural language processing and generation. So I wonder, I mean, my hunch is you always see the data sets before you see the city, B, but I wonder if you'd like to comment on these new dreams or these visions, and are they, do you think they're ethical? Are we doing it in the right way? We've got dark stories here, but
I mean, yeah, you have to be very careful. Like, so the work I'm doing is analyzing textual collections to extract information out of them, and I like to do that to assist to assist humanities and social science researchers. So like in an assisted kind of providing technology in an assisted way, but you can equally misuse technologies, artificial intelligence, and somewhere in the question came up about surveillance technologies, and so we have to be very careful. And so it's good to see that there are these initiatives and lots of roles of people looking into the ethical side of things, that the data analysis on the ethical, that the ethics requirements are there for example, for analyzing healthcare data and that sort of stuff. And try and find the right balance is also important, because if those stop us from doing the research, then that is also not good. But it's important that people don't exploit these things.
I suppose in some ways, Owen Kelly asks whether this, whether you felt like folks, how you felt making it. Was the feeling of the team, was it dark? Is it light? Because I think with the question of data everything's after Cambridge Analytica. We all know that we've got a dark side and a light side to data. We've seen the dark side and the light side to the city. Karen has opened up these questions around whether the economy itself is driven with a dark and a light side, as we get our KFCs in one hand and we watch someone get cut up on their bike. Karen, I mean, how do you feel as someone coming into the city in recent years?
Do I feel like it's light or dark? I have to say that I really enjoyed this. And as Liz probably saw on Twitter, I said, you're winning me over to the city. I've often found Edinburgh to be a very strange place to have moved. It feels very closed sometimes, lots of hidden spaces that you need to be invited into. And yeah, I guess my work is more focused on exploitation in the labor context, so I'm often more focused on people's more immediate material conditions rather than some of the beauty in Edinburgh. As has been mentioned, I think the current moment is also shining a light on those really radical and obvious inequalities, and I'm hoping that, especially when it comes to things like the platform economy and the infrastructuralization of this care work, that moving forward we can make slightly different choices. I mean, I think we are in a very ethically difficult moment, and that extends beyond data. right, to a number of labor practices and civic practices that we are going to have to make choices about as a community.
Terrific. Liz, I mean, coming back to those sense of inequality is, and I wonder how you want to bring Jeff back in, because it must have been quite a moment to connect.
Well, I can do some full disclosure here. It was Ellen, who's up in the gallery there, Ellen Stewart, and Steve Sturdy, who's not on Twitter, so he keeps getting left out of this conversation, who kind of challenged us when we did the first rushes of the film to say that, you know, there's a history here you're not telling. And we're like, yeah, well, you know, pragmatic constraints, limited amount of time, the crew are in Edinburgh for a couple of days, and we're trying to learn so much focused around these particular narratives. But we kind of very quickly, we already knew we had an issue, but there was a history, and I love this city, obviously, but there's a history that's hidden in plain sight. And I really appreciate the nudge from them to just kind of figure it out. And we were lucky enough to get Jeff's time and to kind of, you know, in a half-hour film, you can't go everywhere. But there were enormous big slaps in the face, like the Melville statue that we had filmed and seen as beautiful without thinking about what part of Edinburgh's history it told. And that, you know, that is cities, that is 200 or 300 years of history slapping you in the face. And to go back to Darren's point about Milton Keynes, in some ways, it's a much cleaner and more compassionate city because it's only got a 50-year history, and it was deliberately built. It wasn't built in the mess that Edinburgh is. It doesn't bring together this kind of history of inequality, of suffering, of exploitation, the spaces that people are left out of or can't get into. But Edinburgh very definitely does have, and I think what Leslie said earlier is really striking, the way in which forms of layering inequality have been replicated over hundreds of years in this city. And that's a challenge for EFI. And it's a challenge that, you know, we're all invested in thinking through.
And Ellen, before perhaps we return to Jeff, Ellen, is that those are the narratives, the hopes you had, the texture of the conversation you wanted the film to bring, to add to?
I'm very aware that I'm as white as everyone else that is part of that conversation. And for me, it was quite striking when we saw early drafts of the film that I was conscious of how white the film was looking. I've lived in Edinburgh for decades now, although I'm not from Edinburgh originally. And it's very easy, it's quite a white city. There's a lot that it can be quite easy to miss if you live in the city centre, as many of our students do, and as many academics do too. So I would like to say how grateful I was that the film team were so receptive to Steve and I's very gentle nudges. And I found Jeff's contributions to the film just really remarkably enriching. I've learned so much from listening to him.
And Jeff, have you seen the film?
Yeah.
Again, we've got you on mobile phone, so I'm not sure if you were able.
Okay, no, but I followed the film very carefully, right, and listened to the dates. And one of the things which is interesting, you know, I came to Edinburgh in 1964, and I've got two hats here. You know, there's my brewing hat, and Edinburgh. People should not forget that Edinburgh is one of the most important brewing cities in Britain, equivalent to Burton-on-Trent. And when you arrived in Edinburgh early in the morning on a train, the first thing you could smell is the brewery and bakeries, and that smell is gone. And the brewing school was on Chambers Street, opposite the museum, and that big, beautiful statue of James Watt, which is now in the museum, was there was a statue of James Watt on Chambers Street, you know, in front of the Harriet Watt building. So that's you know, the brewers have gone, and new buildings have gone into their places. But what I would like to mention, there was a date of the beginning of the Royal Infirmary. They 1749. I hope I got that right. And what's interesting, the person who contributed the money to the Royal Infirmary at its inception in 1749 was an Archibald Kerr, who actually owned a slave plantation in which he left to the Royal Infirmary.
Good grief.
And that contained 50 slaves, which was sold in about 1806, you know, to realize the full worth of the contribution. So again, you have a building which would not have been established without slavery. So it's not just Henry Dundas alone.
No.
And what I would like to add is in the 60s, a significant number of the staff and doctors in that building were from the Caribbean and Africa.
Terrific. I mean, I think this is the power of both the process of building, of generating the movie, meeting people like you, and not just providing voice, because you've got tremendous voice, but the ability to get down to some of the specifics and the granularity, and I think the images and and through this conversation alone, we recover and uncover things which are highly charged, but hopefully through the compassion of a building that is and was a hospital, we can move through those facts with sensitivity.
Yes, and change things for the better.
Change things for the better. Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. David, I wonder if we bring you back in the context of your work and how you found it as a process, because I think your introductory speech, all of them were very, very sensitive about framing the lenses, or calibrating the lenses through which all of the academic disciplines wanted to unfold. Did it unfold? Does it do what you wanted it to do?
I think what you just said sort of captures it, that you know, there's an end product to a film, but there's this whole process of getting to talk to a lot of people. And for us, the process of making the film was a lot of walking around Edinburgh. So you know, I think we first, I'm not that familiar with the city, so I of course just confronted the, you know, kind of beautiful facade first, and then as we dug deeper, we found, you know, disputes over urban planning and, you know, these sort of darker histories. So I hope we've kind of captured that by telling this story over time. So I think what is useful about those kind of historical narratives is that they denaturalize any particular way of projecting into the future or looking at the present. And I think, I mean, for my part, that was what I hope to get across in the film.
It does. It just flattens a whole bunch of teleologies, doesn't it? These ideas of the grand narratives, which are perhaps portrayed through some spaces. Nikki, I'm going to bring you in because he said the word walking. And of course, when we think of Nikki, we think of the ability to walk layers of the city.
Yeah, thanks very much. Can you hear me? Because somehow the camera doesn't allow me to put it on.
Yeah, you're very.
So you get me without the vision. So I came to this project basically because I have this project, Curious Edinburgh, which is doing walking tours through the city and tries to kind of like discover some of the stories. And first of all, it was mostly on history of science and medicine, but now it's also much more about communities. And so we're also gradually kind of like finding more stories to tell in different walking tours. And I just put in the chat one on brewing history that was mentioned. And we have the brewing archives in Scotland. That is a rich kind of archive with all the materials from the former breweries that are still kept there. So there's maybe some digitalization work to do there as well. But so this is just one of the layers that we found in when telling those kind of stories about the city. And what I very much liked about the movie, and of course congratulations to the makers, because I think it turned out wonderfully well. And when I was talking in that movie about the layering, when we did the interview, I think of course I didn't see the movie then yet, and I think this layering of the city comes very well out in the movie in a way that the visuals are presented, and also so I very much enjoyed it.
No, thank you. I think that those layers of that palimpsest. I'm going to go back to the Q&A and Coelho Fox, congrats you on the movie.
Can I just
Sorry.
butt in with one thing, Chris?
Sure.
On the subject of the process of the film and how it's seen. There's just there's a link to the Outlook Tower of Patrick Geddes. That most people will be familiar with. Just beneath the castle was a camera obscura building that Geddes took on as part of his idea of a sociological observatory and laboratory that would look out on, watch over the city. That comes across in the film a little, but the film itself is a methodology of being a kind of camera obscura, about finding out, watching the city and representing the city back to itself. And that's never obviously a straightforward process. It's kind of refracted and distorted. But the question of mirroring the city back is a big part of our thinking about how you use film as a methodology.
Oh, incredibly successful as well. I think Sapphire's skills in layering, but somehow keeping us close and then pushing us away and taking us to imagery, symbolic, and then through to people. I think there's a fantastic draw on the lenses, if you like, again. The question from Coelho Fox is, congratulations on the new Futures Institute. In what ways will your new institute investigate and speculate on the convergence of nascent technology, including AI, genomic technology, surveillance technology, and it's challenging our understanding of not only privacy and social cohesion, but, and this is the turn, I think, justice, human rights, and the future of cultural sustainable technology development. And there's a great moment about, I think that the film does, it takes the Enlightenment narrative, which is so very useful and so powerful in the path through technologies, but it does make it social, and it makes it a challenge for society. I don't know whether Leslie wants to take a big question like that, because it's quite a challenge to fulfill all of the humanities and challenge the histories of the sciences. What do you think, Leslie?
Thank you for giving me the hardest question of the year. So absolutely, actually for every inclusion there's an exclusion, and a lot of what we think of in society as community, there are people who are in that community, but community sometimes defines itself by exclusion and who's not in that community. For every positive development in terms of AI and machine learning and data-driven innovation, there's also the potential for a much darker side and a greater sense of reinforcing some of the inequalities that we already have. So I think it's absolutely incumbent on us in terms of all the programs that we're running around financial services, around public services, around creative industries and creative, and around other practices, that we are cognizant of the things that are promoting of well-being, flourishing, and the things that in terms of new technologies that can actually be very damaging and difficult, and we need to be mitigating, we need to be challenging, we need to be future thinking about the potential for further inequality by some of the innovation. And I think the Futures Institute should be the place, the crucible in which we can actually challenge some of the negative sides and promote the positive sides of development. So that's what I would say. But
that's good.
Yeah.
And I think the way that you're constructing the curriculum and the research frames, and then the engagement work, which Patricia, who's I know is critical to the event's activity and is in the attendee view, as it were, but I know she's been central to nurturing those narratives. A fascinating question from Soledad, and you can tell I'm an English lad, grew up in Leicester, and the connection between Edinburgh and Glasgow has always been one which struck me as astonishingly complicated, because it's so damn close. Would anyone like to take the question of in which ways has the Edinburgh identity been built in relation to Glasgow? That's a tricky question. And I wonder, Jeff, you probably have followed geographies, historiographies between the city, the two cities, if you like. I wonder if you're able to come in.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I think because as I say, I've been in Edinburgh, thus Glasgow, since '64, and what I find with the two cities, in '64, Glasgow was, it seemed like an industrial city, in terms of their buildings. Some of them were derelict, and there was grass in George Square. That has gone essentially. whereas Edinburgh was seen as more sophisticated in terms of its buildings, etc. That has changed since 1964. Of course, Glasgow has a very strong historical link with slavery in the Caribbean because of the Clyde. Whereas Edinburgh, people think that there wasn't that link, but there was a link with Leith. In fact, the most significant slave owner was John Gladstone, the father of William Gladstone, the Prime Minister. And he comes from Leith. So therefore, if we add Leith to Edinburgh, there is a great similarity in terms of money. It's just that Edinburgh was the so-called like the financial capital, and it looked like it, whereas Glasgow looked like the industrial capital. But Glasgow, in terms of its architecture, is now very similar in many ways to Edinburgh.
It's interesting, isn't it? Whether you traditionally you might follow the money in Edinburgh while you follow the steel or the ships in Glasgow. And you're quite right. As soon as you start zooming out and connecting the flow of capital, social, economic, and steel, you begin to see the interwoven connection between the two cities. Darren,
of course, they both had merchant. They were merchant cities. In a way, Glasgow said it had an area called the Merchant City, whereas Edinburgh probably just had as many merchants.
It is. Darren and filmmakers, in your days up, did Liz let you go over? Did she let you head west? No.
No, it was not allowed at all.
I want to say this because it's very important that you all know this. One morning, I got up at about 7 and discovered that Sapphire and Darren had legged it over to Fife.
Oh.
I don't know what time they left at 5 a.m, but they didn't get to Glasgow.
Well, I live in Fife, so I'm glad you came over the bridge. I saw that little shot and felt that you had, there's a few of us have connections to the kingdom. So that's terrific. Thomas Mitchell asks, and this could go, well, it'll riff off this, I think, in terms of how we think about people in the city. Edinburgh had quite an industrial city with loads of breweries, printers, shipbuilders, rubber mills. What influence did this have on Edinburgh and the working class who lived and still live in Edinburgh in some ways, because the city still denies to some extent a whole bunch of other communities which are connected to core economies. And perhaps we have gone digital, it's got its code bases, its sky scanners, but it still has a huge history and geographies, and the buildings speak to these pasts. Anyone want to take on a question around?
I'm only going to say something very, very quickly. That is the next project.
Oh, really? Interesting, interesting. Do you want to give us a clue?
We're trying to develop some work around the North Edinburgh area regeneration, particularly around the way the gas works and the cycle paths from the Innocent Railway in the south of Edinburgh to the whole kind of network along the Northern Shores tram lines actually map the passages of Edinburgh's industrial poor, including some of the inhabitants of the Cowgate, the notorious Edinburgh slum. That passage of people through the train spotting, literally the Irvine Welsh story, from Leith out to Granton, reflects a history of Edinburgh that's largely untold, but particularly architecturally untold. And we're just starting to kind of work around that now.
And Sapphire, you must have seen, I mean, judging from the layers you used through the movie, I mean, what's going on there? Because you're taking a whole bunch of libraries, which I assume are informing these histories, these social histories, these economic histories, these architectural histories.
Yeah, and in terms of industrialization, in the Abercrombie book, there's a lot in there, and you forget, like, because you don't see as much evidence of it now, but there was a lot going on, and that goes from railways that are now closed to industrial things to the shipping and all kinds. And I think, yeah, you do see a bit more of it around Leith and North Edinburgh. But in terms of having all the layers and stuff, we did a lot of research in lots of different archives, like you say. It'd be lovely to do one that's in the future that's more of a sort of oral history project, perhaps. But was more to try and show complex histories. And I'm sort of very inspired by Stuart Hall and the narrative construction of reality, and that we try and make histories very linear and comprehensible, but actually they're complex and there's lots of different stories, and they don't always like go in this like this army marching forward, you know. So that was sort of the plan with that style, so to show what you can't just with words, I guess.
Terrific. Well, look, we've got 5 minutes to go, and I wouldn't mind allowing everybody perhaps in this diffracted approach that we're taking both on Zoom, but also that the movie sets up in terms of the various cuts that it makes, the insights. And if I could ask people perhaps to have the last word, each of you, what you thought the film has done, what you think it achieves, and how it might represent the city and the Futures Institute. And who dares to go first? Because that's the brief. We'll work through this. Liz, would you like the first word? Oh, you're on, there we go.
Okay, I think I've spoken too much, so someone else should have the first word.
Okay.
I'll go.
Oh, please.
So I think for me, the film brings home the poetry of the idea, because a lot of the time that we're working on stuff which is very, it's about the building, the physicality of the building, getting all our programs approved in time, thinking about student numbers and budgets and stuff. But there's a big idea behind this project. And it's easy to miss the poetry of what we're trying to do in matching the arts and humanities with data and with the city and the place of the university in the city and the place of this building. It's a wonderful thing that the university has taken on this building to refurbish it. And the film really brings that home, how complicated it is, how layered it is, and the kind of poetry of thinking and the pleasure and privilege to be involved in a project of this scale. So thank you, Liz, for reminding us of the beauty of what we're trying to do while we look at lots of spreadsheets.
Terrific, thank you, Melissa. I'm going to go around my screen. Ellen, I'm going to put you on the spot.
I think the film achieved something really special. I've spent quite a lot of time peeping over the hoardings into the emerging EFI building from the top deck of the number 4 bus. And it's lovely to be able to think about it in more expansive terms. My work is about hospitals and how they belong to communities and how communities value them. And it makes me so happy to see the EFI building kind of being given back to the city in significant ways. And I love the way that the film explores that with real nuance and understands the complexity of the task.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, what did you think? What's it done?
I think there were 3 points for me. First of all, I learned a lot about the history I didn't know. So my research, I'm focusing on how urban planning agents imagine the future. And I guess this was really interesting to learn about the history of Edinburgh's futures. So to gain an understanding of the conditions that actually allow certain imaginaries to sort of appear. I think the movie also conveyed this, the different layers, the role of materiality, which is also really important in my research, which I found fascinating. And I think I generally just really, really enjoyed being part of it and feel really privileged to be part of it.
Terrific, thank you. B, I'm moving around to you now.
Yeah, I think the movie is fantastic. I really enjoyed watching it. I think it's great to just kind of take a step kind of back and just see the whole bigger picture of the whole thing. Melissa put it really nicely as the poetry of the whole EFI idea. And I really enjoy looking back into the history of things, but also seeing the plans of what EFI is planning to do in terms of teaching and research are really exciting.
Thank you very much. It is. There's a whole bunch of things in there. And Lucas, what do you think? What did it do?
Thank you. I also really, really enjoyed the film and think it was a terrific piece of work. And thank you for including me in that. The one thought that came to my mind when watching the film is that after all, the EFI and as part of the city deal is very much part of the data-driven future. And I think too much in data-driven futures is often thought through the framework of disruption. and it's often a quite mindless disruption. And I think the film, in a very beautiful way, does the opposite by bringing really history as an obstacle to a future into the play and making it something that we cannot ignore, but also which we have to be very attentive to when we want to develop a future that does justice to sometimes a very difficult history. And I think that was really, really well done. Thank you.
I entirely agree. Karen, it's a different city and it's a moving city, isn't it?
You know, Chris, just as you're asking me, people are clapping for the NHS outside my window, so might be a
timing, perfect timing.
Yeah. You know that, I mean, I couldn't agree with Lucas more. The film helps us find our home, like where we live, and very much find ourselves in this moment. And I think I've said this to some of my colleagues in STIS before, coming here as a stranger and someone who's trying to build a life, I think sometimes we need to write our own manifesto for what it means to be an academic and a scholar here now. So I think the film is a beautiful introduction to do that, and the whole EFI project is a place to do that. And I just, yeah, how do we kind of bring the community continually into these conversations so we're not just speaking to each other?
Well, let's do a clap. I think that's a great insertion into the
Would you be my window here?
That's great. I think that's great. I think moments like this are exactly what the film does in time, but how a cut again action allows that, a social cut takes us out of a moment, which cities do, but wonderfully put. And thank you for that moment there. Leslie, does it help you explain what EFI is all about?
So for me, the film reminds us of our responsibilities, our actual civic responsibilities, our responsibilities as academics and what academics are actually for. So I think it's a really, really important thing that we are reminded that we are we have in some level, a very privileged lifestyle, that we can go into an institution, we can educate, which is such a privilege, we can do research and follow ideas, it's such a privilege, but all the things that we do have to have some importance and some impact in the wider world, and working with communities and listening to communities should be informing our work. I think I am very privileged also to be working with such creative individuals. Seeing the film makes me proud to be part of the Edinburgh Futures Institute and working. You've seen so many people on the film, and also the makers of the film, who are just wonderful to work with. So thank you very much indeed. I think the film is wonderful. But as I said, it reminds us of responsibilities, and we have a lot of work to do because the planet is in a very fragile state.
Thank you. Nikki, and then we'll do Jeff. So Nikki.
Yeah, hello. So yeah, I think what the movie did for me is very much the first time I came to the Edinburgh Futures Institute and I heard about that, and yeah, also heard that it was moving into the hospital, or that was like replanted in being the Future Institute. I started to talk with Ellen Stewart, who's also on the panel here, about this importance of the history of that building and how we needed to preserve this history, also to bring it into the future and to learn it and to make it part also of the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And I think what the movie is doing is really showing this kind of like importance of also the past, not only of the building, but also of the city, and showing how that's still very relevant in the future. So how communities and connections to the city and the importance of science and medical development, and how the university contributes to the city, but also how this should be done in interaction with the city and how it's shaping the city. So I think those are things that the movie is visualizing, and is really making that in a beautiful way. That it's a very good movie, I think.
Thank you. 5 stars from
exactly.
Jeff, your voice in the movie is very, very important, and I'm so pleased that the team involved it. Would you like to say anything as we begin to close out tonight?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I just think the film is excellent because what I think it shows, and what it's trying to say, is that cities and buildings, are not just stones and plaster. They're people.
Terrific. And that the body of the city, I think the team do such a good job with everybody to allow us to explore and understand the scars on the body, if I can extend the metaphor, but also some of the vision and some of the hope that it probably has in its soul as well. I don't know if the team want to have the true final word. You present so much and you articulate it so carefully at the beginning.
Well, my most important final word for those of you who are not on Twitter and I've not said it to, is that I'm so grateful to all the voices and all the people who spoke to us and built the story of the film. But even more importantly, to Chris for being a supreme MC, bringing this all together. I have no idea how you just pulled it off the last 2.5 hours.
No, Lauren, please congratulate. Lauren's behind us. She's still hiding. Give us a peek, Lauren. There we go. Thanks. It's not easy running these things, but it's been a pleasure with everybody here. It's been easy. Terrific. Darren, Sapphire, David, any last words?
Just thank you for your time tonight, and thanks everyone for watching and for your feedback and comments. It's been really nice to share it in this way. Unusual, but really lovely. So thank you.
And you pasted it into the chat link as a YouTube as well, which I'm sure we will tweet multiple times after this so people can catch up with it. And yes, use it in their teaching, which is such a lovely comment earlier as well. Darren, David?
If I may, add my thanks to everybody else's, because that's where we're at. But I think that we talked about compassion earlier, and I think it's really important listening to what other people have said as well, Leslie particularly about EFI, the compassion about the project and how we integrate with each other is ever more important. And the way the film works, the way it puts layers together, the way it reflects on what other people have done, like the Abercrombie diagrams that Sapphire referred to, the way the stuff just gets stuck on top of the geography of the city. There's so much to explore and interrogate in everything that's laid down on that groundwork. And it seems like the EFI is a really great place to be doing it. So thanks.
Great, no, thank you. David, do you want to?
Sure. Well, I just also want to thank everyone for the help with this and for the EFI for being so supportive. And I think what the film does for me is show that all of these different ways of talking about the future have limitations. And I think it's appropriate to do this in the context of the EFI, because what that implies is that we need interdisciplinary work, we need different voices, and we need participation. Outside of academia, our ways of skiing have blind spots. We need appropriate.
Just lost David's final words there, really. But hey, that was Closes and Opens. Thank you so much to everybody who took part. Thank you for the many attendees and the many comments. I couldn't keep up with the chat, but it was brilliant. And thank you for the great questions, very sharp questions. We weren't Zoom bombed. I thought you saw a terrific movie and you've had a great evening. I'll let you leave now into your respective homes and return to, well, it isn't normality at all, but it's a way we know each other, and we'll get to know each other through these systems and through great movies like this that help us understand the place we live in and work in. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to press the red button. Unfortunately, it's not like a normal movie premiere where you get to leave and share popcorn. It's a bit of a cut. So thank you very much to the team and to everybody who's taken part. And farewell, and we'll see you on the other side of the future.